Welcome to Masterpiece Online, and to what is the last of our talks programs, all of which are centered around conversations. This afternoon's talk, Museums and Mentors, Scholarship and Friendship, Stories from the World of Fine Ceramics, takes place in collaboration with the French Porcelain Society, and I know it's going to be a really fascinating insight into their world. I'm delighted that so many of you from all over the globe have joined us today. Masterpiece, with its ethos of cross-collecting, the careful mixing of works of art from all periods and regions of the globe as a cohesive whole, owes its success to the passion, connoisseurship and scholarship of our exhibitors. In the absence of our physical fair this year, we are relishing the opportunity to showcase this knowledge to our existing and new audiences through our online talks programs, videos by our exhibitors hosted on our website, and short Instagram TV movies. Discovering about works of art through the voice of a passionate exhibitor is absolutely one of the most engaging ways to foster appreciation and knowledge. I would strongly recommend you visit our website, our Masterpiece website, and our Masterpiece microsite on the selling platform Artsy, which I hope you will find reflects the character of our physical fair. The website is a really wonderful and exciting way to explore the fair, and I think you will still find allows the serendipity and opportunity to discover perhaps unfamiliar works of art that is such a hallmark of Masterpiece. For those who might wish to catch up on some of our content, the Masterpiece highlight tours are now online at masterpiece.com, and next week the panel discussions will become available. We are dedicated to supporting our cultural partners who are facing great challenges due to forced closures of public galleries and museums. This year, we are offering unlimited free access to all artworks, conversations and content during Masterpiece Online. In return, we ask that you consider donating to the Masterpiece Cultural Fund to support museums here in the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and in Asia, and a link to donate is included in the chat box. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our moderator, Martin Levy, who really needs absolutely no introduction. He is remarkably a fourth generation London-based dealer in furniture and works of art, but a pioneering scholar of 19th century design and patronage. And aside from numerous art-related board memberships, his wise voice of reason resonates in the wide discussions relating to our art world. Martin, I'm now going to hand you over to introduce our wonderful panelists, all of whom incidentally are Masterpiece exhibitors, and allow you to get the proceedings underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, and hello to everybody, wherever you are in the world. And it's lovely that you have found the time this morning, this afternoon, or this evening to join us, as Philip said. First of all, I'd like to introduce the panel of speakers who are with us this evening. And I'm going to start with John Whitehead, who we momentarily lost as we were setting up, and there was a certain rumor went round that perhaps a wonderful Seab Terrine had turned up somewhere in the country and off John had gone, but no, he was with us, as one would have expected. So John has been an antique dealer since around 1980, initially in French furniture and works of art, but soon specializing in Seab porcelain. He's been a member of the Council of the Furniture History Society in the 1980s, a committee member of the French Porcelain Society at various times, including now. He's the author of French Interiors in 18th Century, French Interior in the 18th Century, published in 1992, Louis XV Serve and Louis XVI Serve, both in 2010. And he's an officier of the French Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, which he was awarded in 2010. Errol Manners trained in the Chinese department at Christie's, and Errol has dealt in a wide range of ceramics from the Middle Ages to the 20th century, from a shop in Kensington Church Street, London. And he's a former chairman of the French Porcelain Society. Adrian Sassoon is based in London, where he was born. He's well known for his work with French 18th century porcelain and for bringing the world of contemporary ceramics and glass to an audience of art and antique collectors. And Masterpiece is the one fair in the year at which he shows both old and contemporary pieces. And you can see Adrian surrounded by some of those pieces on your screen. And last but not least, we come to Michele Beiny Harkins. And Michele actually read law and had articles set up with Goodman Derrick, but then she was asked by Nelson Rockefeller to come to New York and be part of his team, working on his art collections and the reproduction business he was setting up. But this was cut short after a year when Rockefeller died. And after that, Michele joined the family business, the Antique Porcelain Company, founded by her grandfather, Hans Weinberg, in London in 1946. And in 1987, I think that's the correct date, she started her own gallery. Michele serves on the board of the Bar Graduate Center in New York and is president of the American Friends of the Wallace Collection, as well as a member of their International Council. And in 2016, she was awarded an Iris Award for her service to the decorative arts. So I think you can see that this group is representative of the best that the market has to offer. Each of the panelists might be described as a scholar dealer, and between them they have decades of experience, an infectious passion for their subjects. They possess a deep knowledge gained in a variety of ways. Their interests are constantly evolving, and they have a generosity of spirit. And most importantly, perhaps, they're all extremely good company. Mark Jones, the former director of the V&A, describes museums in the current issue of the Art newspaper as houses of wonder and places of public congregation. He goes on to ask if museums might return to a simpler and less expensive model, reacquainting themselves with their collections. And it's really with that thought that I want to start and ask you, were there museum collections in particular that in your formative years played a particular part in encouraging you to follow the path that you've now done? John, do you want to start?
It's a treat to be here today, and it's always wonderful to talk about the subject that we love. And so it's great to be doing that right now. And I have to say that when I came to London as a student in the 1970s, it was so splendid to be able to visit the Wallace collection, the V&A, the exhibitions at the Queen's Gallery, which were for me particularly splendid, in the old Queen's Gallery. And there were some fabulous exhibitions put on by, I didn't know him at the time, but Geoffrey de Bellaigue, who I then met some years later. And seeing all those things, having been interested in the works of art since my youth, it was just fabulous to be in in the most major center really possible for me, apart possibly from Paris. And so just discovering all those things was quite wonderful. And then joining the Furniture History Society, and then when it was founded, the French Porcelain Society, and meeting everybody who were the curators of all the museums I'd been able to see and all the specialists. And it has really felt like a big, very happy group of friends, almost a family for all that time. And I think we'll all agree on that, probably.
I'm sure that everyone will. Michele.
I don't know that there's any one particular museum that I would sort of choose over any others as being particularly influential on me, except you know, we have got, I think we've each chosen stories about some museums that have provided interesting and entertaining events in our lives. And so maybe I'll talk about that, because and then for that we would need slide number 3, please. Here we go, slide number 3. And the story of this tureen is one that involves a major porcelain museum in the world, the Dresden Porzellansammlung. And this is a story that sort of predates my involvement, really, and it's more reflects on my grandfather and my mother. But we had this tureen in the gallery in London, and the then curator of the Dresden Porcelain Collection, Ulrich Peach, had made a speciality in his life of pieces decorated with the fantasy animals and the chinoiserie by Adam Friedrich von Löwenfink. And he did finally publish a book on that. But this was his passion. And he had come across a book by William Blackburn, who was a dealer and scholar, illustrating this tureen and another one of the same shape but with slightly different style of chinoiserie decoration. He had fallen in love with those, and it was his desire, his ardent desire to own them. So one day he came into the gallery, to my mother's gallery, and he saw this tureen. Well, he almost saw this tureen because he saw the bottom of one tureen and the top of another one. And it turns out that William Blackburn had published the pair, and then my grandfather had purchased the two of them, but because they looked the same to him, he had switched the covers. And so a tureen that was half from the Earl of Jersey service and half from what is called the Schwarz-Gold-Streifen service, which is the black gold stripe service. And you can see the black gold stripe at the base of the cover and at the very base of the decoration on the tureen. And my grandfather had swapped them around and sold this mismatched pair to a collector in southern Germany. Anyway, so Ulrich said, but this is so wonderful. I love this tureen. I so much want it. And he said to my mother, you know, how much is it? And the mismatched tureen that she had a very high price on it. And he pointed out to her that in fact, you know, it wasn't a proper pair, that they didn't match. And she paused for a minute, thought about it and said, yes, you're right, but that's not changing the price. So that was my mother, for me, absolutely determined to hang on to whatever price she had made on something, and she wouldn't give an inch. He then went on to long for this thing for a couple more years and met the collector in southern Germany who had the tureen mismatched as well, never having realized that the two halves didn't go together. Anyway, he now was very overexcited and really, really wanted to buy them, but funds were a problem. And then at that point, a terrible tragedy happened in the Dresden porcelain collection, where the shelf of a showcase with their priceless collection of Böttger stoneware and very early Meissen collapsed, and it smashed everything in the case. And years later, there was restoration. Some of the pieces were saved, some of the pieces weren't, but there was some money that came from an insurance claim, and he was able to buy this tureen, now put back with its correct top and bottom. The collector in southern Germany now has a proper tureen as well, and there the two of them are together. So there's a sort of museum stories that I remembered from before I started that made me think how wonderful it would be to be in this business.
Those are the stories, Michele. I think they give us all a great buzz. It's a lovely story. So out of misfortunes and mismatches, good things happen. That's a delightful story.
And I ended up being a porcelain dealer.
Very good. So no harm done. Adrian, do you want to talk about a little bit about collections or museum collections that you were inspired by when you started or when you were very young?
And just hello everybody. That's a photograph of my stand at Masterpiece last year behind me, showing how I display both French 18th century porcelain and contemporary ceramics and glass and metalwork all together. And I'm mainly thinking about the historic pieces today as I talk, and that also started for me as from my grandparents, from my grandmother. My father's mother collected French 18th century porcelain. When I was quite young, she died. Everything my parents had in London was just sort of thrown out to the country because it wasn't as good as Granny's things, and that got me interested. What were these things? And there was quite a lot of 18th century French porcelain. So I got interested in the subject, but I was at school and I also started getting my hands into wet clay then, and I did 2 hours of ceramics lessons a week for 2 years, which isn't really very much, but it means you sort of I have a basic knowledge of how some things are incredibly difficult to make and some things are, actually I could do that. But it's taught me to take a different look, because I can remember getting my hands dirty making things, and that grandmother I mentioned actually lived around the corner from the Wallace collection in London where I grew up, and so I was sort of aware of this thing called the Wallace collection, and she also had some friend of hers who used to run it called Francis Watson that one heard about occasionally. I may mention him later, John Smiling. He was an amazing character for those who didn't know him. Unusual, a great scholar. but an extraordinary personality. And so I was aware when I was young of sort of looking at French porcelain in the V&A, which is now all displayed in a manner it's not quite as welcoming as it used to be, and the Wallace collection is more welcoming than it's ever been. And then I've had an interesting connection with that because I've been a trustee there for 8 years subsequently. But my career kicked off in museums. At the age of 19, I started doing Xeroxing and coffee cups at the Getty Museum, working for Julian Wilson in the Decorative Arts Department. And the first day I turned up, she said, "You busy for lunch?" I'm 19, I'm on the Pacific coast. Why would I be busy for lunch? She said, "Okay, Francis Watson's here, we'll have lunch with him." And I'm like, I'd never met him before in my life. I'd heard of him, and I knew he knew that old grandmother of mine. And of course he said, "Oh, I'm Doris Herschel's grandson." "Oh, difficult woman," he said. "Yes, I know, but that's not my fault." And stories came out of it from then. And so my career kicked off with my connection in museums from the age of 19, working in a museum for 5 years. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Adrian. So the only person we've not heard from so far is Errol. Errol, are you here?
Yes, my answer is a very obvious one. It is the Victorian Albert Museum as a sort of porter at Christie's initially, and then as an expert in the Chinese department. It was Sundays, weekends spent in the V&A, which is the most comprehensive collection in the world. I mean, that's where I learnt my sort of craft visually, and then visits to New York. It was the Metropolitan, and there it was the sheer quality of the collection that sort of was awe-inspiring. But beyond those very, very obvious sort of choices, it's the unexpected museums. A favorite of mine is a little one, the Instituto Valencia de Don Juan in Madrid. You have to make an appointment to go there. And that opened my eyes to medieval Spanish ceramics and Baroque Spanish ceramics. And then other museums like the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum set me on sort of paths of exploration. This was a collection, a sort of time capsule of this great prince. And it's set me on a sort of journeys of discovery, which I'm still sort of working through today.
I think we go on learning every day, and I think that's one of the great pleasures. But were those visits in the earlier days, earliest days of your involvement, or some of them slightly later?
Well, we're all, I think, museum junkies. I mean, the greatest pleasure in life is traipsing around Europe, visiting new museums that one's never seen before, and the discoveries you make in them, and how enriching they are. So since whenever I could possibly spare the time, which as a dealer, we do have the time to spare. You know, whenever I went, if I had to go to a sale in Munich, you know, you'd spend a few days, you'd do all the museums, and I'm a slightly obsessive photographer. I take pictures and all these things and archive them. No, visiting museums is hugely enriching.
Yeah, and I think that experience, I mean, I understand that absolutely, touring around the country or other countries and having those extra hours or those extra days to go and absorb
the great American museums. I mean, that's another endless source of amazement.
Yeah. So moving on slightly from museum collections, I wondered if we could talk about curators per se, and I wonder if in your younger days in our business, there were curators who took you under their wings, and Adrian's already mentioned Gillian. But if there were particular curators who saw your interest in things and encouraged you to take it further, maybe to take an interest in slightly different material, or to look more deeply into the things that you were beginning to have a feel for. I mean, John, do you have stories along in that area?
Yes, absolutely. One very important influence for me was one day in Paris in the 1980s, going to a meeting of the Amis de Sèvres, the Association of the Friends of the Sèvres Museum. I was introduced to Antoinette Allais, the director of the museum, and she said to me, "I do not know any of the London antique dealers. None of them have ever invited me for lunch." So I thought, I got out my diary and said, "When are you free?" And she said, "Next week." So the next week I had lunch with her, and she said, "I am looking for a collection of Vincennes porcelain." So I said, "Oh, well, I know somebody who wants to sell a collection of Vincennes porcelain." and that was done very quickly and very easily.
Yeah.
And it was just unbelievable. And then the reserves of the museum were just freely open in a way that perhaps more relaxed, was more relaxed then than they are now, with slightly more organized systems. But it's been a fabulous journey at the Met with Claire Le Corbeiller and Gillian Wilson at the Getty, and in so many places. It really, and it continues. And one of the joys, as Errol says, is going to a place, town in America or in Europe somewhere, and the curators are always anxious to take you down into the reserves. And with my friend Cyril Froissart, once we were visiting the Ceramic Museum in Rouen, and we said to the curator, do you have a reserve? She said, oh, well, there's a room at the top of the building with nothing much in it. Well, can we please go and have a look? And we found some unbelievable treasures there. It's the discovery, the people, the objects in all those places. And it doesn't stop, it carries on.
It absolutely, and I mean, you're pointing to really one of the dangers of precipitative deaccessioning from time to time, when those collections have been boxed up for decades and no one's looked. And you're absolutely right. I suspect you've all had experiences of walking in to the back rooms or the basements of museums and finding extraordinary things that just haven't seen the light of day. And I seem to remember in my childhood going into the stores at the MFA in Boston, and there being not one, but about half a dozen or more goat and bee jugs, you know, just on a shelf down there. So, Michele, do you have similar experiences with an individual curator or any curators who've been particularly encouraging to you?
Well, I've had such nice relationships with so many curators during the course of my life and ongoing now. So I don't know if there was one, but because for me, the big influence on getting started was a collector rather than a museum. And he was a wonderful man called René Grog. And he gave his collection to the Louvre. So in a way, that's the connection. But he was a great collector of French furniture and 18th century objets. And I met him quite by chance when I was still a law student, and I was at university. And once again, Nelson Rockefeller had called me in London and asked if I would go and view an auction for him in Paris. And it was for some Tang horses, actually, and Tang camels, great big ones. And because you couldn't talk to French auctioneers and hope to get any sort of correct answer in those days, we're talking about the 70s. So he asked me if I would go and translate and supervise and make sure everything was as it was supposed to be. So there I was in my jeans and, you know, tie-dye t-shirts, and off I went to Paris. And I was there, and Nelson, of course, put me up at the Crillon Hotel. And so everything was really rather wonderful. And my mother then called me and said, we've got a client and he's just thinking about buying something very important, a very, very important piece of Sèvres. And if you'd all like to see it, we could put it up on the screen, and it is my number one. And she said, if you've got to call him and try to make a contact, because I haven't managed to ever meet him, because I'm in New York, yeah, he's in London. It was a difficult time for us when my grandfather had just died. And she said, but you must learn to do this. You must make a contact. I'm 17 years old and slightly nervous. But anyway, I call this collector, René Grog, and I tell him who I am, and I'm Michele Beiny, and I've come from London. I'm just here for a day, and I'd love to come and see his collection. And he said, what do you think I am? I'm a very important man. You can't just call me like this and expect me to be free. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll call again next time I'm in Paris. He went, be here at 7 o'clock. He hung up the phone. And I was absolutely terrified. And I said to my mother, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this. And she said, you are doing this. And we're backwards and forwards. And guess who won? My mother, she always wins. And so I went, and it was a fantastic Hôtel Particulier on the Avenue Foch. And the doors opened by this liveried butler, and the entrance hall had a boule commode with a Kranach above it. And then you turned the corner and there was a Memling, and I thought, this is something special. And I was taken into this office with this most enormous Louis XV desk and Gobelin tapestries behind him. And he was a big, tall man, and he was sitting at the desk. And he then described it at some point in the future. He said it was le coup de foudre. He fell in love with me instantly. And I became his great favorite, and he took me under his wing. He and his wife, who was a dress designer called Carven, wanted to adopt me and everything. Anyway, we had marvelous times together, and they then started to buy porcelain enthusiastically for my mother, but the rule was that I always had to come and deliver it and stay for at least 10 days or 2 weeks. And I delivered these wall lights, which are a fantastic piece of Sèvres wall lights dating from 1760. It's this tricolor Sèvres that Adrian talked about the other day at the FPS lecture, because the Getty has a pair of vase potpourri Dauphin, which are part of this same set that was purchased by Madame de Pompadour. And I delivered them to him in Guadeloupe. And so I flew down, and I had my 2 boxes with these precious things inside, and I'm very nervous, you know, I haven't, you know, I'm still a student, and I don't know about how to do all this sort of thing. And we land in Guadeloupe. I'd flown from New York, and this giant Rolls Royce was waiting for me on the tarmac. And René was there, and the chauffeur, and I get in, they take these bags away from me, we get into the chauffeur-driven Rolls, and there's no immigration, there's no customs, and in we are, and we just drive to their lovely home, which is at the beach there. And so started a wonderful, wonderful relationship with them, and they taught me so much. They introduced me to so many people, and that was my start.
And I think again, all of us will have those sort of stories, and I think one does become really very close to a lot of the people that we are fortunate enough to meet in our professional careers, and become as much friends as seems appropriate and as is possible, and learn an enormous amount from the worlds that they move around in, and the people they introduce us to, and the things that they give us access to seeing. Adrian, can we hear from you?
Actually, I can add something to that story, because I gave a lecture at the Sèvres Museum in the mid-1980s about the Getty Museum's collection of Vincennes and Sèvres porcelain, and I illustrated that pair of wall lights that Michele's just been showing and talking about. I remember the entire audience of people from Paris who knew all about Sèvres going, "What are they? We've never seen them." And I'm like, "They're in Paris." And it was before they'd been given to the Louvre. They were completely unpublished, but at the Getty Museum we knew about them thanks to Michele and her mother, and having this pair of vases from the same set made for Madame de Pompadour. I remember thinking, I'm like 25 and I'm showing you all something that you didn't know about. I could get used to this. And it's good fun when you're talking about things. And that was really one of those things that Gillian Wilson employing me at the Getty Museum exposed me to a whole mass of people who all told me stories. And there was Francis Watson was there with us for 3 months of the year. And sort of en passant, extraordinary stories appeared, which I seem to bore people with from time to time. But also, we used to have all these amazing sort of variations of different experts from other museums. There were extraordinary people, like no one ever mentions David Dubon from Philadelphia Museum. He was very, very unusual and very nice, but he was also a scholar of Renaissance furniture, which not everyone wants to look at. And he used to come for long periods, and I would have to look after him. But we had people on the porcelain front like Rosalind Saville and Geoffrey de Bellaigue. Tamara Prayer used to regularly come to Los Angeles, and we used to really pump them for information about our collection and what was going on. And for some reason, maybe the less you know, the more you remember. That might be the story of my life. And so there's all sorts of things I remember about these people. And that was completely in my 18th century world. But I must point out that my work with contemporary objects is also very influenced by some of the people that you wouldn't expect. But at the V&A, for instance, there was both John Mallet, who a lot of people know, and Oliver Watson, were specialists in historic works of art. They used to drift through anything that was happening where contemporary ceramics were being made, and their colleagues would look at glass, and they would just think, that's really good, that's really interesting, it's adventurous, it's contemporary, it's new, groundbreaking, buy it for the museum. And the museum just automatically bought and bought and bought. And I think that was a big influence on me, that you can apply and should apply the same criteria you apply to antique and historic objects to contemporary objects. And perhaps in the contemporary ceramics and glass field, and especially silver, that had not been the case until the last 20 years when I've been pushing those boundaries. And it's thanks to people who really, really apply historic principles of quality that, in fact, you enjoy contemporary much more, I think.
And I think in that context, you can mention Judith and Nicholas Goodison, who've done a tremendous amount to bring their interest in older, more traditional fields and that rigor to bear on contemporary things, and been very generous to the Fitzwilliam and so on with that.
Well, I hate to say a naughty story, but try stopping. So,
no, please go
on. I was in the Fitzwilliam, I suppose it was about a year and a half ago, and all the things that Judith and Nicholas Goodison have given to the Fitzwilliam Museum, their choices, they just buy and buy and give and give. And they are on display in various ways, very informally, but seriously throughout the museum in the appropriate places. Well, I actually went to see a special exhibition which had come from America of the history of British ceramics since 1940. All I can say is the Goodison collection was a lot better than the exhibition.
Yeah, interesting. Personal drives, often a very good thing in forming collections, I think. I know we're going to go on and on talking, and I think we need to cover, maybe just drift into a slightly different area of our interest. And I really want to talk to you a little bit about publications. Some of you produce catalogues yourself, some of you lecture, others have contributed to exhibition catalogues and books. So I think what I really want to tease out of you is the sort of, are there key publications that have had a particular interest, or books that you bought in your youth that you still refer to? And Adrian's talked 2 or 3 times about Francis Watson, and I still have my own very well thumbed 1956 a paperback version of his really tremendous catalogue at the time, covered in really juvenile notes that I made as a child or as a very young person going around the museum. And also I remember being given Geoffrey de Balague's Waddesdon catalogues for my 21st birthday. You know, I think those are things, and you know, I still have them and I still dip into them from time to time. So Errol, are there books that you particularly swear by?
Well, there are some that have been revelations. One, actually, not particularly a ceramic book, but it impinges on ceramics, was Taste in the Antique, Haskell and Penny. I mean, that was an astonishing, it's a sort of book that crystallized so much which you sort of vaguely knew or thought you knew, and put it in with this sort of beautiful sort of simple logic, and explained, they were trying to explain not which were the great classical sculptures, but which were the ones that were important and relevant to people at a particular time. And so that's a book I refer to. And you know, there are, well, in our Sèvres world, of course, there's Rosenthal, Geoffrey de Balague's catalogues, and people like Meredith Chiltern on the Commedia dell'arte. I mean, great books that have sort of rewritten and humanized the subject.
Mm-hmm. John, you've written books yourself, but you're very welcome to give those a plug. But I mean, equally, are there other books that you greatly admire, or articles or exhibition catalogues?
Well, I have to say that there is such a wealth of material out there. And if I could have slide number 12, please, you'll see some of my books. And when I was writing my French interiors book in the early 1990s, I made a list of several hundred articles in learned reviews like Apollo and Burlington and so on. And I got my friend who was then sort of junior curator in between jobs, Selma Schwartz, to spend about a week photocopying all these things. And she came back, in those days there weren't all the nice new machines, and she had to get bags of 10p pieces from the bank and take it and go to the libraries and pump them in one by one. And she came back with her hands absolutely black. And this wealth of articles and things that have been done by scholars, really mostly since the Second World War, although a few before, there is just so much out there that one can learn with. And these days, you don't need to photocopy them. So many things are available online. And it is quite extraordinary how between articles in learned publications and all these museum catalogues that have been coming out in huge quantities, and also, of course, sale catalogues, which are a marvelous resource. And I make a point every morning when I arrive in my library of taking 3 or 4 sale catalogues at random off the shelves and flicking through them. And I always find something that's relevant quite by chance to what I'm studying that day, you know, among several thousand catalogues. It is just extraordinary.
Trips to the warehouse to find a catalogue usually take an entire day. By the time you've gone through it, everything else you run across just purely by chance.
Right.
Adrian.
Well, as a fun book, I'd nominate Sven Eriksson's Early Neoclassicism in France, because it not only do I really love that period, it's sort of goofy and wonderful and inventive, and it's just got a lot going for it, but also it's a book which takes a period in time and shows it to you from architecture, painting, furniture, ceramics, silver, which is a very French thing perhaps to interconnect in that manner, or that it's just so influential at any one moment. Paris has always influenced the rest of the world, it seems, brilliantly. And so that's my sort of one to drool over. I had a job for 5 years working for a great furniture dealer called Frank Barent, who was a great friend of your father's, Martin, and he had a very small library of books, but he knew everything in them because he just leafed through them for years and years and years, the same books. And there's a lot to be said for knowing less well, but he had instant recall of a certain volume of visual information. But I find myself, I'm better at talking than at writing, but I went off-piste about 3 years ago and wrote a book about a great, great friend of mine who's a jeweler called Joel Rosenthal, worked from named Jar, and there was an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he was very against anyone writing about him. And a few years before, I was sort of thrust into it, well, if everyone thinks there should be actually a real article, you write it. And so I ended up writing about somebody highly intellectual, highly clever, witty, and a friend, and in the public eye, and that's quite challenging. And I thought, there's no point drawing attention to myself when they said you need something in the fly cover about your career, and I said no. But then I thought, hang on a minute, some people who know me are going to think there's another Adrian Sassoon out there, which is a pretty odd name for people to have. But it's quite fun, actually, when you can get your head around a subject you don't really work with, but you know well. And that's quite nice. I think it's very good for us all to go a bit off-piste like that, no less seriously, and whether, you know, all sorts of different subjects. I think it's very good training for one to clear your head. But all of us have to research our historic objects, and we're writing mini essays, mini you publish more, Martin, but we're all really writing publishable material about our historic works of art all the time. It just doesn't all go for publication.
But it does all get taken up one way and another. I mean, they go into bibliographies and so on of other publications. Michele, you told me earlier that you're writing a book about the collection belonging to Natalie Robinson. Do you want to tell us something about the work you're doing there?
Well, yes, I mean, it's a lovely collection which has been lovingly formed by Natalie over the last 35 years at least, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to help her with that collection for a big part of that time. And so during lockdown, when we didn't know what to do and we were all housebound, it suddenly occurred to me that we should get cracking on that, because we'd always vaguely talked about doing a catalogue, and so the time had come to work on it. And so Natalie has been an active participant, and I've had lots of help from John and Adrian and Roz. Everyone's been very generous. David Peters has been marvelous, and we're having a lot of fun. We are fine. I mean, so much has been written, you think there's never anything else to find out, but there are always things to find out, and you find print sources and interesting stories about some of the characters who owned these pieces, who commissioned them in the first place. So there's always stuff to be found out, and so that has been a really fun thing to do, and that's going to be published as an online catalogue. So, which I think will be really great fun. It's less expensive to publish it that way, and also it can continue to be added to as people make comments about it, or more things are discovered, and so it'll be a sort of evolving work, which I think will be nice.
That is one of the joys of online publishing, that it can be edited. As new information comes through. And you mentioned all your French Porcelain Society colleagues who've been so helpful, and I think it's one of the, John mentioned it earlier in connection with the Furniture History Society, but it's very noticeable what a very friendly and collegial group you all are.
And competitive.
I'm sure you're competitive too, which is why we were very happy that John joined us and wasn't rushing off doing something he shouldn't have been doing. So we've really, we've discussed how you got into dealing. And I'm wondering, and I think it is quite interesting to know to what extent your dealing has evolved over the period you've been in. And knowing all of you, I've seen that if you started very strictly in one area, as we probably all do as younger dealers, little by little you've expanded. And the person who's clearly exploded into other areas has been Adrian, who has done so much with contemporary ceramics, glass, silver, and so on, much to everyone's imagination. So we'll come back to Adrian because it's, that's a huge thing. But I mean, Errol, your dealing has really changed, or at least evolved. And we see William de Morgan with you. We see all sorts of things that perhaps wouldn't once have been the case.
Yes, though I think they all go back to my early interest in ceramics. In fact, I did write a book, a fairly general book called the Ceramic Source Book, covering the whole world of ceramics, back in my Christie's days, or just when I left Christie's. And I look at it again, and those are all the areas from China to Islam to European ceramics that I'm still really interested in. I've discovered a few new ones, like the ceramics of colonial Mexico and things, which I knew nothing of when I started. But I'm astonished actually how the great things that I loved and tried to deal in early on are still the things that I'm truly passionate about.
Mm-hmm. John?
Well, when I was fortunate to discover Sèvres porcelain through an object I bought quite by chance, which turned out to have been part of Louis XV's Bleu Céleste Vincennes service. And I thought, oh, well, this is nice. And I got interested. And for years, having been brought up to despise the 19th century, for years, I wouldn't touch anything 19th century, but gradually the 19th century.
I was brought up that way too.
Well, yes, but you broke out of it much more quickly and much more brilliantly than me. But gradually, we've started looking at later things in the 19th century. And now that my son is starting to be interested, well, James is now buying the mid-19th century and into the 20th century. And so it's wonderful to have a sort of that sort of journey and helped by it being with him.
Michele, do you have a particular story about the evolution of your dealing career?
Yeah, going into that would also be going into the 19th century, because obviously I inherited a big collection. I grew up with this, huge collection of porcelain, and the word 19th century didn't even exist in the lexicon of the Antique Porcelain Company. So when we started to get interested in it, and it is a sort of, to go from the 18th century to the 19th century is a huge intellectual leap, actually, because the aesthetic of it is different, and so it's not an obvious leap, but you can't believe that we didn't make it earlier than we did. But I remember in the very early days when we started off, one of the very first things I bought was with John's help, and we bought the service of the potters. So it was a Sèvres service from the 1830s with paintings of all famous potters through the ages. And John brought it over to London and unpacked it with my mother peering over our shoulders as we were unwrapping these pieces. And she gasped in horror and said, "Sell it for whatever you can get." But one thing I remember, John found for me a marvelous piece in Paris at the Louvre des Antiquaires years ago. And it was a piece which actually we can illustrate as well. It's number 2 in the in my little list of photos. And he discovered this piece, convinced me that we should buy this object. And he said it really is marvelous, and you know, and a very important 19th century piece, Renaissance revival. And it arrived in New York literally at the last minute, just as I was unpacking to do the Winter Antique Show. And I opened this box, I put my hands in, I pulled this thing out, and I went, "Oh my God." And I phoned John and I go, "What are you thinking? This is the worst taste of anything I've ever seen. It all clashes, it's garish. How can you possibly think that we could sell this?" Anyway, I put it out in a nice prominent place in my stand. And, you know, on opening night, you know, Jeff Munger from the Met comes in, and he is gobsmacked by this piece. He thinks it's absolutely marvelous, and he starts raving about it. And I went, "Yes, isn't it fantastic?" It's such a bold combination of colors, faithful and yet original take on the Renaissance. And now it has pride of place in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. But and now I do think it's wonderful. I really do. I think it's so much fun. I think it is bold, and it is forward thinking, and it is showing off all the sort of technical superiority of Sèvres in the 19th century. So, but it wasn't an easy transition, and now we just look at it in a completely different way, and see the beauty and the advantages and the developments that the factory made in the 19th century as a marvelous progression. So,
and it's interesting how American museums were actually quite early in collecting that material, maybe before the market. And if you think of that wonderful exhibition in Philadelphia, the Napoleon III exhibition, which I think was in the 70s, 78 maybe,
yeah,
a really important, influential exhibition, and I think, again, a catalogue that many people still refer to. I can see we have 10 minutes left, but Adrian, please tell us about your transition to your fabulous, this is not a plug, you know I love all these things, but your contemporary material, at which you've been such a wonderful pioneer.
I think it just happened rather by chance. I was taught to make things, as I mentioned, at school, so I collected things from the 1970s onwards. I was collecting contemporary works of art, and after 5 years at the Getty Museum, 5 years with this other dealer in London, I decided to work for myself in 1992, and I started doing the Horton's Ceramics Fair in 1994, I think. And to cut a long story short, I had a few pieces of 18th century, but I thought, I'll show them all this modern stuff. There were reasons. Antoinette Allais from the Sèvres Museum was one of those reasons. And I thought, well, I'll do this. And I took a stand which was not only tiny, but also was actually under the stairs. So if you stood up over half the stand, you'd hit your head on the bottom of the stairs. I mean, it was really very ramshackle. So it's quite ironic that nowadays I have these enormous stands at some of the shows that we do. But it's taken off from there. I have a couple of amazing colleagues who came from the Crafts Council who tuned me up onto more of the artists, and we try to bring artists from across the world to audiences that wouldn't otherwise see their work, and mature artists, not people just out of art school. And it just all takes on. Ceramics, glass, they're all sort of cross-collecting addictions, and people are very happy in a ceramic world. They'd be happy in a ceramic world crossing several centuries. You don't have to buy everything, but it's very understandable from one century to another, and that's been of great benefit for me.
Thank you. I think let's do one more thing, and then with some very interesting questions here. But can I have my slide 19? I just want to talk about your desert island objects. The one thing that you would all take onto a desert island if you were to have living. Now, I apologize for this photograph. It's a detail, and I suspect that it'll somewhat surprise you, because you probably would have thought I'd have chosen something by William de Morgan or Christopher Dress or whatever. But I have to say, this is an object every time I'm in Paris, I go back and look at, if I have the time. I just think it's the most delicious, super example of 18th century Vincennes porcelain. And actually, I looked last night at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs website, and it's described there. And I'm just going to read you a bit of it, because I think it sums it up to perfection. It says, this sauce boat resembles a surging, curling wave, edged with blue foam, rising in jagged peaks as it sweeps seaweed and coral in its path. A veritable manifesto for Rococo art. It represents the culmination of the skill and absolute mastery of 18th century French porcelain makers. And that was written by Tamara Preo. And I certainly couldn't improve on the description, but that to me is the most delicious object. But how about all of you? What would you take? John, what would you take to a desert island?
Well, if I could have my slide 14, please. Many years ago, Michele and I went to visit a lady in Paris, and the lady and her husband were great collectors of everything. And we sat down to have tea, and she fished a little leather box out of her handbag and handed it to me and said, open it and look inside. And I did. And there was the famous Choiseul box by Van Blaurenberg, the wonderful gold box with miniatures of the inside of the Hôtel de Choiseul. And she, apparently for decades, she just carried it around in her handbag and played with it whenever she could. And so it was absolutely one of the most magic moments to actually hold it in my hand. And then at about the same time, I was lucky enough to find this lovely, very rare Sèvres gold box, gold box with Sèvres plaques. And I felt so passionate about it that, like our friend in Paris, for about a year, I wandered around with it in my pocket until one day the Louvre wanted an object to buy in memory of Daniel Alcouf, who was leaving after many years as head of the decorative arts department. And I was very honored that they bought this box from me. And it's smaller than a kitchen matchbox, if some of you know what that is, but it's just a magical little object.
I'm going down the list in order on my screen. Errol.
Yes, if I could have slide 10. I've always loved Isnik ceramics. And this is one in the MAC in Vienna, the Museum for Applied Art, Museum für Angewandte Kunst. And it's so special, I think, because, well, the form and the outer border is Chinese. It's a yuan, a 14th century dish, effectively. And the center is like a sort of Persian miniature with his sass leaves. And it's a bit of sort of highly, it's Ottoman court art, and I like it for its sort of vibrancy and its muscularity. I think there's something wonderfully special about the very best of Isnik pottery, and something dreadful about the very worst of it. Thank you.
Adrian.
Well, mine would be wrapped up in a Savonnerie carpet, and then the image in number 18 is the object. And since I wouldn't be able to take a dog with me, I'd want an animal to talk to. And so here's a cup and saucer, and I just love this. It's on the cover of a book these days on the subject of Vincennes porcelain. And it's a cup and saucer made of Vincennes with this lizard forming the handle. I used to own that. I bought it. It was in the middle of the night in Los Angeles, bidding on the phone, an auction in France, and bought it and sold it when John sold my entire first collection of Vincennes porcelain to the Sèvres Museum, which is where it is now. And it's there's one in the British Museum, and there's another one which I bought since. But this is the one that's the most pretty and the most attractive. And I just feel I'd have someone to talk to if I had that, as well as one of my favorite objects, which I sold in 1992, sadly.
It's a gorgeous thing. And before we come to Michele, I think that we know what the chairman of the fair would take to a desert island, because on Instagram the other day, there was a photograph of his toast on a William Beckford plate. But we'll leave that on one side. Michele, what would you take to a desert island with you?
I would want to take a piece of sculpture rather than a tableware, usefulware. So I love porcelain sculpture, and I love animals and birds, and this extraordinary pair of Chelsea owls would suit me very well on the desert island, and presumably they'd also keep the mice away, so my little store of food on the desert island wouldn't get consumed by rodents who were frightened away by these charming little fellows that I used to own, but sadly not anymore.
Oh, they're beautiful, absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have 5 minutes, and so I've got some questions. I mean, there are so many good questions here, and we simply can't answer them all. I'll answer one very quickly because it's dead easy. Ronald Strawson has asked what was the name of the Francis Watson catalogue that we mentioned earlier, and I've got it in my hand, and it's called Furniture, Text with Historical Notes and Illustration by F.J.B. Watson, and as I said, it was published in 1956, and it's definitely something to get on Amazon or whatever these days.
And he asked Nancy Mitford to help edit the English, so that's rather nice as well.
Did not know that. I'm just looking at it at random. Jeffrey Ruder asks, please, do the panel members have any comments about auction houses as a training ground for dealers? I would speak hugely favorably about that from the moment I did it. Errol?
Yes, I mean, to me, my 6 years at Christie's was a university, it was and a PhD, it was a lot. And we had, we were working with great people, actually. There was Hugo Morley Fletcher, nutty as a fruitcake, I hope he's not watching, but touched
You
with
take it as a compliment.
Well, touched with a bit of genius, and Anton Gabzevich for the English porcelain. So, you were working on a daily basis. And the best job I ever had was when I first started as porter, European Ceramics warehouse. I was the chap, I had to put the right label, the catalogue would come out. I had to say lot 83 was a Meissen figure of a carpenter. And so you did that for 18 months. You basically knew the bones of ceramics.
It was a wonderful training, Errol, when there were weekly sales in every discipline. Yes. And that sadly is something that is not the case anymore.
Yeah, and the auction houses dominate. Sotheby's was before Christie's was Tim Clark and people. Great figures.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Ludo de Walden has asked, what is the single most brilliant object you have personally dealt with during your illustrious careers? Quickly, anyone? Your favourite object? Yeah, Adrian.
A great big dinner service that was in a museum's basement, and I used to go there in America. I used to go there every 2 years, for years and years and years, and curators would come and go, and eventually I managed to sell it to some people who had the rest of the service and put a great 1770s royal service back together.
Very exciting. Michele?
Well, the first thing that came to mind just now, because I wasn't expecting that question, was a beautiful large Potpourri Pompadour vase, Vincennes one, that was also made for Madame de Pompadour, that I got from a collection that was famous for its Meissen, not for its Vincennes, and sold it to a collector who just loves very splendid things, who lives in New York. So that was, it went from London to New York, and in fact the seller was Geoffrey Tate. Oh. So yeah,
good.
Great.
Very quickly, so I'm going to cut you off. John, very quickly, and then Errol.
I suppose that what gives me most pleasure is when I'm privileged that people who've had old collections formed by grandfather or great-grandfather come along to me and ask me to sell things for them, things that haven't been seen on the market for over 100 years, and that just the joy of the collectors seeing things that haven't been continually through auctions and that are not known. And it's the pleasure of the discovery, or even however modest the object might be. It's the pleasure of discovering something for the first time. And it happens constantly. It's brilliant.
I can completely understand, agree with you about that. Errol, last word to you.
Well, my slide 7 is one of a number, and it's a pair of redware vases that Tonala from colonial Mexico, they're big things, 80 odd centimeters high. These were considered great treasures in the 17th century in Europe, and these recently, where we saw to the Metropolitan, where they were in their Making Marvels exhibition. I mean, to me, it's a subject I'm really involved in at the moment, and that was hugely satisfying to find and thrilled that they went to the Metropolitan.
And actually interesting that they ended up in that wonderful exhibition that was the last thing we were all able to see before the lockdown of the Met. And it really was, Wolfram Copy did such a fabulous job on that remarkable exhibition. Now, I think all I can do is thank you all so much for the conversation. Clearly, and we knew it would go on, or be able to go on for much longer. So before very long, we'll all be able to have dinner together, and then we can continue the happy discussions. But thank you all so much. And thank you to everybody very much for tuning in.